Today for the meeting is to discuss a design doc that I have published titled Multi-Source Config Model for Istio. So if you'd like a link to the document, it is in our working group meeting notes under today's date.
Also on the agenda, you may want to present, or I can present.
So because of the room difficulties, I can't present.
Okay, I can present.
I can present a QuickAttack, but I don't know that they would appreciate that. All right. So essentially, the problem that this design document tackles is that the number of command line arguments involved in Istio components has exploded. I don't know over how much time it's taken to explode. There's a table that spans pages 1 and 2 that shows the distribution of flag definitions using Cobra. It gets quite complicated for our customers to manage. And in particular, within a Kubernetes environment, CLI flags are non-trivial to edit. They're not naturally grouped into key value pairs. They can be under the command definition, or they can be separated out into the args. So it gets a little bit difficult to manage there. It's also, let's see, the total number is over 300. It's very difficult to come up with useful names that are not exceedingly long for our flags, with over 300 names that need to get managed. One great example is in Galley, introduced in 1.2, we have the config file flag and the config path flag, which are almost entirely unrelated. They sound very similar. So what we'd like to do to be able to solve this long term, we'd love to be able to source the exact same config that we're currently getting through flags. We'd like to be able to get that through config files and potentially through environment variables. However, in doing that, what we don't want to do is introduce a totally different naming scheme or a totally different validation process for the information that's going to come from a config file. As far as the process is aware, they need to be essentially identical values. So fortunately, this is a pretty well-solved problem with a package called Viper. It works well with Cobra, which is what we've used as it is to do our usage statements and other details around command line flags. And it simply allows you to read command line flags from multiple different sources. So in Istio 1.2, we have moved to this model for Galley in particular, somewhat as a proof of concept. And this design document proposes that we leverage that pattern to also apply to the other Istio binaries. Are there any questions so far?
Just a few comments. I would vote for Pilot Agent to be the next one, because that's the most difficult one to configure with command line flags due to injector.
Okay, in terms of prioritization, that makes sense.
And I put some comments on the doc. I mean, I'm strongly in support of this. We also discussed in the environment working group and about how to set up the environment variables, and I mentioned your document. I'm a big fan of this proposal.
Very cool. Thank you. So if we scroll down to page 3, we can see some examples of how config can be specified. So one thing that I haven't addressed so far, while Viper allows us to use exactly the same flag names in a flat JSON or YAML file, it also gives us the ability to specify aliases for flag names. So one flag can be known by multiple names. Those aliases in turn, using a dot delimit, can allow us to use a structured config file. So if you look here, this first setting is essentially general.meshconfig file, which is an alias for Galley's mesh config file flag.
Do we need this feature? I mean, I think it will be more confusing than, because the whole idea is to use it as a transition to have everything move to config files that operator will also use. And because anyway, people do not interfere with the flags. I mean, it's only the installer that will set those things. And for the installer, it's much more beneficial to have exactly the same syntax without any aliasing.
So the difficulty with keeping them flat is that we still have the naming problem. We have 300 names that we would need to maintain in uniqueness that can get exceedingly long.
Do we want this? I mean, my understanding was that we are going to move to use config file, which is structured, and then the environments will override by using the dot notation. I mean, you can use dot. I mean, mesh global dot food dot bar dot whatever.
That's right. So that's how the environment would override these variables.
Yeah,
go ahead.
No, that's what we need. I mean, that's the most important features that we need from this thing to use the existing values.yaml config format, because that's the source of truth. That's what users interact with, and then all the flags, environments, variables to be basically using this schema that is already known, documented, and used.
But I think we are conflating a couple of things, right? So the values.yaml it's a bit higher level, whereas this is more geared towards the components configuration, right? So components, some of these things can be overridden, and some features of Galley, for example, is optional, like dial-out mode, for example, and which requires some detailed configuration, like about which auto model to use and things like that.
But the whole idea is that with the installer and operator, in both cases, the user will interact with values, mesh config, let's call it mesh config, the new name for values.yaml. This thing will be checked in as a CRD and will be watched by operator and will be kind of the source of truth for everything. Yes. Everything that is used in Galley, flags, environment, or whatever is derived from this particular file and these settings. And it will be available as a config map and can be mounted.
So you're saying that there would be one config file for everything that everything uses as its configuration?
There already is. I mean, we already use it for the injector, for example. The values.yaml, as used at install time, is checked in as a config map in next to the injector.
Right. So that's totally feasible given this technology, but it's not necessary. So we can do that. We can do, other than that, this technology, or this proposal would just give us the flexibility to decide. However, what I would say is, given that if that is the overall direction that we want to move towards one config file for all of Istio, the hierarchical naming that you're seeing demonstrated here becomes even more important.
Yep.
Because you now have all of those names in one file.
To clarify, the direction is to move to operator, which will mean that. So currently we have the one config file, which is values.yaml. Operator is proposing additional config files that will be defined part of the operator. But it doesn't matter which one it is, there will be a set number of well-defined CRDs that defines the mesh configuration and operation. And I would hope that this will be the source of truth, because that's the only thing user will interact with. No user will ever directly modify. Does it make sense?
So okay, let me understand this. Is the model such that the operator is going to push these things as config maps, quote unquote, to the individual deployed things like Pilot or Galley, or do you expect those to be pushed through other configuration channels?
They may be pushed through different configuration channels. They may push to MCPs. They may be mounted as config maps. I mean, depending on environment. I mean, it's not only.
But I think it's crucial, right? So take the connectivity example, right? Hey, telling Pilot, here's the MCP service that you should talk to, right? So that needs to be defined, like co-located with Pilot somehow, whether it's part of deployment or like a config file. It cannot be read from the source itself. So there's a bootstrap problem.
That would be a config map, yeah. So right now we're using config map for injector and we're going to use it for Pilot and a lot of other things. So config map is definitely a solution because it can be editable in JK and other environments.
Right. And so the way I look at this proposal is essentially a bit scoped to that level of problems. Like given that you actually have a binary that needs to be configured at the local level, there is the config file, the config flags, command line flags, and the environment variables, and a config file, right? So this kind of gives us a solution to configure at that level. Now, at that level, the component is now bootstrapped, and then you can get additional configuration from outside as well, right? So
who do this work? Who will set those flags and do this work? Because the user will only interact with operator CRDs and values.yaml. There is no user never modifies anything except the installer.
Well, that's true for Kubernetes. That's not true for other environments, right?
For other environments, it's the same thing. I mean, we have a file in Mesh Expansion, for example, and that file is installed. It's edited by user and systemctl restart. That's reading the config file.
Yeah, but essentially that needs to have some values in it, right? So it's essentially you need to be able to say, here's your MTP server. And it's not going to be, it is something that needs to be configured at that level.
Yeah.
It's just that it can be configured through automation or through a setup scripts,
sure.
Which is fine. But essentially, all this is saying is, okay, let's have a sane model for that, right? It can be the environment variables, config file, whatever it is, right? So
absolutely agree. But also, to be clear, I mean, that will be values.yaml, the same CRDs that are used in Kubernetes will also be deployed Ansible or whatever on the VMs. I mean, it's not, we don't want to have a completely different configuration format for mesh expansions and
of course not, right? So that, just to be clear, I don't think I'm proposing that. It's just that all I am saying is, I think if I am hearing right, the way I am seeing this is there is two levels of configuration, right? One applies to the component, especially for Bootstrap purposes. And then there's another configuration that is the configuration for once the Bootstrap is done, right?
I don't think I agree with this statement because operator and installer are operating at Bootstrap level. So yes, I agree with you that there is a Bootstrap configuration, but that's values.yaml and what installer uses as input. There is no other user editable Bootstrap.
So I think this is an interesting conversation that probably merits its own design document and discussion. The design in question here enables either.
Yep, I agree.
So this is the proposal at hand is just to allow us to source the config from multiple avenues. And then the strategy that each component will use to source them, whether it's from one central file or multiple files, whether users are interacting with them, that's, I guess I would say, TBD.
I agree with you, and I think that's something that the operator and the installer should handle this. I mean, because in the end, any other configurations that is used in Kubernetes environment are derived from the operator and or from installer.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think we disagree on that. I think
I don't
that's.
think we disagree.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure that we are not overusing this feature. I mean, if we stick with what you described with Viper and that will be super awesome, and we have the flexibility to do other things if we need it. But
yeah, so definitely providing flexibility provides the potential for abuse. For instance, if we updated our installer to use half command line flags and half config files, that would be exceedingly confusing for no apparent reason. So it does introduce the potential for abuse, but it also introduces a lot of flexibility and I think opportunity for improvement of the overall user experience.
To be clear, we already do that. And I mean, again, a lot of things are passed easy because Kustomize and other tools work better with environment variables and the Bootstrap in Envoy, it's using environment variables and a lot of things. So we are using environment variables quite a bit. And we also have the command line flags. And my intent is to get rid of command line flags with this proposal. So everything will be environment variables or config file. Or config file and maybe environment as overrides.
So to be clear, this technology does not provide the capability to do that explicitly. We don't have the ability to say we don't allow command line flags using this technology, but as a segue, it would work for that.
We have review for that. I mean, we can put a linter or something in the installer and make sure that config flags are not used. It's not.
That's right.
Yeah. I have to go. Sorry for too much feedback.
That's all right.
All right. Thank
So
you.
you can see here, this is the YAML file. This is a JSON file that essentially is equivalent to the YAML file, just minus comments. And then on the next page, you can see a flat YAML file that does not leverage the nested arguments or the nested variables. And then finally, what the equivalent command line flags would be. The only place where these values are treated differently is within the Viper library. By the time they make it to Galley proper, they are identical values that have the same validation rules, etc.
So what we would do is in Viper, you would specify that both mesh config file and general.mesh config file, one is the alias of another. Is that-
Yeah, the general is technically an alias of the other. And at that point, they're used equivalently. You can Viper get on either and get the same value. You can even technically set on the command line flag, you could call that mesh config file. It'd be -- general.mesh config file. And that would work as well. We're not advertising that particular part because
Right,
it doesn't
yeah.
make any sense,
There's no
but
point in doing that.
it is possible.
Okay.
Okay, so one critique that we've heard of design documents recently within Istio is that they languish in the proposal phase and never get formally approved or rejected. Others get implicitly approved after they've simply been presented to the group, assuming silence is consent. Is that how the config working group wants to continue?
Okay, so there are two questions here. One, is the config working group the right place to approve or not approve this particular proposal? So for Galley, I think we already discussed and implicitly approved. So
Yes.
if you keep the scope of the document to config work group, I think we can just put our names, like Martin and my name, and we can mark it as approved. But I think your intent is to push it for Istio General, which I think makes me think that this needs to go up to the TOC level. Unless we hear major feedback for change, I don't think it's just happening now. So my suggestion is,
Martin's proposal was essentially that we approve it here and then that it gets a secondary approval from TOC.
yeah, so which I think is kind of the right model here, and I think it's implicitly approved here. So and then we can-
So I'll speak up and make one comment. As I know, there's a couple other people on the call that will probably back me up, I think. So what it sounds like you're trying to do is at least move Viper to replace Cobra across all of the tooling, which would also be Istio control. And I know there's a bunch of work that is ongoing and still ongoing for like tab completion. And going to Viper will basically nullify all that work.
So to be clear, Viper does not replace Cobra. It works in conjunction with Cobra. So as far as I understand, and Eric, I'd be happy to test this out with you. It should not affect tab completion in any way within Istio Cuddle.
Okay. That was my concern. And if, like I said, I haven't played with it. This is brand new to me. So
Yeah, if you would like, I'd be happy to sit down and test that with you.
Okay.
So in either case,
I have used Viper and it works great with Cobra. I'm concerned about what I see on the screen about how we forked it though. What did we need to do to fork it and why can't we use the mainstream one?
Sure, that's an excellent question. So Viper, as it exists in the I think it's SPF 13 repository, Steve, his last name escapes me anyhow, had a bug where the nested property management that allows things like general mesh config that we saw in the YAML and JSON files, that structure is incompatible with aliasing. So you could either name the command line flag explicitly with no alias using dots for structure, or you could have aliases, but the intersection of the two was not compatible. I introduced a pull request and talked to Steve about the request. And essentially what I was told is that I was welcome to take ownership of the project and then could merge it. And otherwise it was unlikely to be merged particularly soon. So after talking with Martin and a few others on the config team, it was agreed that we don't really want to own, like I certainly personally don't want to own a config command line processing utility for Golang. That's not a core part of my mission at Google or a core part of Istio's mission. At the same time, we very much wanted to be able to use Viper to accomplish these goals. The amount of code duplication that this avoids, I think is substantial enough to justify maintaining a private fork. That being said, Ed, if you're interested in owning a command line processing utility, I happen to know one that might be interested.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was not the way I wanted the conversation to work out. I would be much happier to be working directly on the upstream. I think that realistically, Viper and Cobra ownership is going to be something that needs to get solved in the larger Kubernetes community, as it is rather critical to many tools that we leverage on a daily basis, and ownership is currently in question. Ownership is the wrong word. It's maintenance status.
Stewardship.
Yeah, stewardship. There we go. Thank you.
Okay. So one, I think I wanted to mention before that comment was for Istio Cuddle. This might in fact may not be the right model for the most part, but I don't think it hurts. Like, you know, just having this in there is, I don't think it's going to change the front, like the mainline behavior or mainline experience for the users. But I certainly don't see like config files or environment variables as like, you know, being the primary usage model for that tool anyways, right? So
right. Where it could be particularly useful is like, for instance, setting the kubeconfig flag as an environment variable.
Yes.
So you're not having to repeat that every time. But you're right, limited usefulness there otherwise.
Yeah.
Right. There's already hard-coded stuff for the kube config flag, and currently there's very little that Istio Cuddle does that is long-lived the way these other things do. Usually it's all interactive stuff.
Yeah, but I think like if you take the idea a bit further, you can easily think as having this like a Istio Cuddle config file in your home folder. You know, the command line for the config file pointing there by default to your home folder, and then you can put like, you know, kubectl or kubeconfig configuration there, or, you know, maybe some other settings there as well, right? So I think that would be an interesting model.
Yeah, you know, the Kustomize people did a really excellent blog post within the last year on their reasoning. If you've used Kustomize yet, it explicitly restricts you from setting any values on the command line. So think of like Helm, how you can do -- values and then explicitly provide an override. You cannot do that with Kustomize. And the reason that they gave to justify it is they want every run of Kustomize to be reproducible from source control without the use of a bash script. And so if we think of that same pattern for Istio control, I'm not sure that there's a one-to-one correlation there, but you could see some value in having reproducibility from source control for certain particularly complex Istio control commands. We do have 64 command line flags defined in Istio control. So I've never seen an example where somebody is using more than, say, 2 or 3, but in the rare case that might be, it does make it much more reproducible. Then again, if there's not value there, you know, the old saying, if it ain't broken, don't fix it. We don't necessarily have to push this out to Istio-CTL if there's not consensus. And Ed, I suppose that would be probably at the discretion of the user experience working group?
I will ask people what they think. My thought is that it's not needed, but that if it is popular for the rest of Istio, it makes no sense to be different just because no one will be using the feature. I don't particularly want to test. I read a bunch of tests that are specific to Viper, but if needed, we can do that.
My hope would be that we could test Viper from the forked Viper repository sufficiently to trust it. It does not introduce substantial changes. Actually, I reference in this document the pull request for Galley. You'll see within that pull request, there's some changes to like documentation generation and things like that are one-time changes, would not need to be repeated as this is moved out to other utilities. But if you look at the changes just within the Galley command folder, you'll see that the actual changes necessary to accomplish this are not extensive. And that was an explicit goal. If we were going to have to write extensive per flag logic to accomplish this, then it would just be much more flexible to define our own library and not have to worry about Viper. Oh yeah, also ignore the vendor folder because that was a terrible nightmare that I hope to never do again.
I think modules is gonna work out for us.
Yeah, I think so too.
Okay, I gotta go. Before I do, I think this is the last item on the single item on the agenda. Any final feedback? Any final thoughts on this, folks?
All right.
All right.
Thanks, guys. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
All right. Thank you.